to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Greg Sheppard. Now, Greg is a Georgia native who grew up around the Stone Mountain area. He graduated from UGA in 1974 with a bachelor's in agricultural science. And then he went on later to obtain his master's in public administration from North Georgia College and State University, right? Greg became the Lumpkin County Extension Director for the county, for the UGA Cooperative Extension Service. That's a mouthful. Some of Greg's articles may be found online today, which provide advice on growing grapes to gathering ginseng. Greg has been a longtime member of the Historical Society since he and his wife, Rita, have moved here. They both have an active interest in history. Greg has served in many of our leadership positions, from vice president, president, to a member of the board of directors, which he still currently serves upon. In 2002, Greg received the Madeline K. Anthony Award for his work in restoring the old brickwork in the historic 1884 Old Jail Museum. Over the past several years, Greg has had an active interest in researching the history of gold mining, with a specific interest of the Consolidated Gold Mining Company, of which he will talk to us a little bit about tonight. And please welcome our guest speaker, Greg Sheppard.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to have to start with a little disclaimer. I've been retired a long time now, so if I kind of get lost in the bushes or in the weeds tonight during this talk, bear with me a little bit. But we're going to talk about the grand opening celebration at the Lumpkin Consolidated Gold Mining Company. Now, you know, today, if a new business opens at the Lumpkin, Chamber has a ribbon cutting ceremony for them, right? No Chamber of Commerce back in 1900, so there's a little different process they went through. I think it's kind of entertaining, so let's take a look at it. To start with, I think it might be helpful to take a snapshot of what Dahlonega and Lumpkin County was like prior to the Consolidated Company getting started. The last census before the company got started was in 1890, and at that time, the county population was less than 7,000 people in all of Lumpkin County. The county seat here in Dahlonega, less than 900 people in Dahlonega. So we're talking small town. Now, gold had been mined here since 1828. But we got to remember that as they moved up from the creeks to hard rock mining and gold veins, as they began to dig downward in these veins, once they hit the water table.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm being a bad one.
Greg, I'm sorry. It's just that the recording without lights is impossible.
Oh,
So could we?
That might be best if they can't see me.
Let's try like that. Thank you. Sorry, we're learning how to do this.
But as they dug down following these veins, once they hit the water table, they discovered that a lot of these gold-bearing veins were high in sulfur content. They either were pyrites or what they call the sulfide gold-bearing veins. And when they hit the water table, that material had not had time to oxidize. So when you mine that ore out, it wasn't captured very efficiently on the amalgamation plates in a typical gold mill like everybody was using. You would lose a large percentage of it, just floated right off. So it really stopped anybody from mining much deeper than the water table at that time. And also, we've got to remember, at that time, no industry in the county, there was no railroad to get here either. So kind of a quiet little mountain town back in 1890 to 1898. But if we say 1898, what immediately comes to mind? Spanish-American War, and also the Klondike Gold Rush. Most everybody's familiar with the Trail of 98, the Klondike Gold Rush started in 1898. It was in all the newspapers. Even the Dahlonega Nugget frequently ran stories about some big discovery or somebody who struck it rich up in the Klondike. But also, there's a lot happening out west in towns like Cripple Creek and some of the other cities in Colorado and out west. A lot of people were really making their fortunes in gold mining. Of course, a lot of people were losing their shirts too, but it made the newspapers, you know, all this excitement was building about the gold rush back then. So not surprisingly, there were a lot of wealthy investors that became interested in how they could get involved in the gold mining game, you know, and maybe make their fortune in the process. And it just so happened there were a lot of investors, wealthy Northerners, from the area around Toledo and Delaware, Ohio, who were really interested in where they could invest in gold mining properties. You know, it's a long way to the Yukon from Ohio, and it's a long way to Colorado from Ohio. But relatively speaking, it's not that far to Dahlonega from there. So they began to think, you know, maybe we ought to try our luck down in Dahlonega. And you know, you got to remember, even though this is a number of years after the Civil War, the South was still pretty depressed following the Civil War for decades afterwards. And there's just not a lot of money available in the South to develop a mine with the state-of-the-art technology. So these Northern investors picked a good time to come down to visit with us. Of course, they did their due diligence. They visited Dahlonega and toured the mines in September of 1898. And they particularly were interested in the property that was owned by Christian Wall. That's the old hand gold mining property. Most of you the hand ditch. They were really interested in that. So they decided that they needed to do their due diligence and investigate these opportunities. So they went down to Atlanta and visited with the state geologist, W.S. Yates. And if you wanted to talk to somebody about gold mining back then, you could not have picked a better person, because he literally wrote the book on the gold deposits of Georgia. Many of y'all may have seen this bulletin 4A. His title, Gold Deposits of Georgia. He was intimately associated and familiar with all the gold mines in the state of Georgia. So he was a good person to visit and talk with. They talked to him at length. He sent him back up the road with a copy of his book. They also took with them a lot of photographic views, pictures made by our local photographer. Went back up to Ohio and up north and began raising funds. Now you got to admire these guys in that they did not let any grass grow under their feet. They were busy. As soon as they got back, they started raising funds, and they contacted the Superior Court, Lumpkin County, and got a business charter issued. And the Dahlonega Consolidated Gold Mining Company was incorporated in October, just a month later, 1898. The business was capitalized $5 million. Now that's an appreciable sum today, but you got to remember, if you correct for inflation, most of the inflation factors that I've seen, it's a little over $30 to $1. So $1 in 1898 is worth over $30 today. So they actually, you could consider this an investment of $155 million. So they had some big bucks at their disposal. Well, you know, when Walt Disney decided to build Disney World, everybody in Florida didn't know that's who was buying all the property down around the middle of the state. You know, those orange groves and swampland and all that stuff in the center part of the state, there was a mystery buyer for a long time before it finally came out that it was Disney buying. Well, the same kind of secrecy the Consolidated Company tried to start with. It was interesting, in October of 1898, the word hadn't really gotten out, and the cover story was printed in the Dahlonega Nugget. The owners of the Wall property are having all their houses about the mines vacated so as to begin repairing them. New ones will be built so they can accommodate their laborers having families. This is a move in the right direction. Very often hands have to walk 2 to 3 miles to and from their work. Pretty good cover story. Tell all your employees, y'all need to move out. We're going to renovate all these houses. And then, of course, they were getting ready for the big sale. But the company closed on most of their property in November 22nd, and the secret was out from that point on. The next week or so in the Dahlonega Nugget, the editor, always on the ball, checking things out, he quoted a newspaper from Ohio that said, J.C. Rosenthal of Delaware, Ohio, is en route to Dahlonega, Georgia, where he will file a deed covering the entire properties of the Dahlonega Consolidated Gold Mining Company at that place. The properties in question represent 4,671 acres of mineral land. 4,671 acres. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with measuring acreage, you gotta remember 650 acres is a square mile. That was a lot of property they obligated. Well, this property acquisition, they included a lot of mining properties. I've listed here the Hand Mine, which was owned by Christian Wall. That's going to be the headquarters for the company. But also it involved the Gahula, Lawrence, Upper and Lower Cane Creek Mine, War Creek Mine, Finley Mine, Barlow Mine, a lot of mining properties, about 10 different mining properties. Hence the name the Consolidated Gold Mine. They consolidated all these gold mines under one ownership. Well, the 20-mile hand ditch, this is a portion of one of the trestles of it. It was also included in this and all the easements pertaining to it. In addition, they bought forest land because they needed a lot of timber to run their chlorination plant. Had a lot of timber that was going to be needed to mill to make all the buildings. And they bought the sawmill and tannery in J Community. We had a program about J Community that last year or the year before.
2.5 years ago.
Yeah, but they bought all that businesses down in the community of J. They also located a significant iron ore deposit in the northwest portion of this county, and they obligated it. So they were really going around town buying everything inside. And of course, they bought some residential property in town for office space and for commissary that they were going to open for their employees. So what was the community reaction to this? What do you think people in Dahlonega thought when all these damn Yankees came down here and started buying everything inside? Actually, if they'd had a brass band, that's what they'd been doing. They were excited beyond belief. You know, here we had sleepy little Dahlonega where you could farm, you could run a shop in town, or you could make moonshine. That was the main things that folks were available options for you back then. Instead, suddenly we had this company come in. They were spending money hand over fist. They were buying everything in sight. Good times are here again. Boy, it's a businessman's world. And the immediate economic impact was stunning. Now, remember, they only started the charter in the end of October. February, they had 100 employees. 100 employees out of a town of less than 900 folks. And that rapidly grew to 200 by spring. But the company was planning on building a 4-story chlorination plant, 4-story mill building, cleaning out and renovating the 20-mile-long ditch. They peaked with an employment of almost 600 people.
That's
600 people. That's a huge workforce. The Dahlonega Nugget, June 30th, mentioned that Vice President George Raymond says that the company expects to spend $200,000 right away. Now today, $200,000, your house may cost more than that. But if you add that to the inflation factor again, that's over $6 million. They're just going to drop $6 million right away in town. That's a pretty nice investment. And in July 4th, the Nugget reported there is no calculating the amount of good the Consolidated Gold Mining Companies do in this country. Every industrious laborer, with or without a team, is given employment getting the mine ready. If you had a wagon and a team, or if you just wanted to work, you could get a job with Consolidated. They were hiring. But the impact extended well beyond the line. We got to remember in those days, you couldn't just get everything locally. W.G. Spencer had 6 mule teams hauling lumber full time. And a Mr. Buddesy received a contract for 200,000 board feet of lumber. He had to go to Dawson County because he couldn't find local sawmills that could furnish as much lumber as being requested. As a matter of fact, during construction, the Consolidated Gold Mine actually used over 1 million board feet of lumber and 75 railroad carloads of heavy machinery. So it's a lot of material to bring on site to get this place built. You've heard of Quillian Corner. Colonel Quillian from Hall County had 23 wagons hauling material here for almost a month straight. He had to hire 60 extra people just to bring stuff to town. a massive undertaking. By the way, for those of you that don't know, this is the massive rock crusher for the Consolidated mine coming through the square of Dahlonega. It had 20 mules, about 16 pulling, and the rest of them kind of acting as brakes. It was a 9-ton load. They had to build this wagon. There wasn't a wagon that would accommodate a 9-ton load like that. So they had to build that wagon specially. It had tires that were 6 inches wide. The rear tires, I'm told, weigh over 300 pounds each. And it took them over a week to get that from Gainesville here, because every time they went downhill, they had to deploy ropes from that wagon, wrap them around trees on the side of the dirt road, and slowly play those ropes out and lower that wagon down the hill. It's so heavy. So massive undertaking to get everything here. Of course, the excitement kept building, and our editor, W.B. Townsend, we've had programs about him before, and most of you, if you've done any reading in our local books, you realize he was a pretty rough old rascal. He called it like he saw it, and he was not one to sugarcoat anything. But this quote from him just amazes me. You know, he was in the habit during the construction phase, he would leave his office, walk a mile downtown, down to the Consolidated mine, and he'd see what was going on, walk back up and report on it. And he said, it's like an exposition. You can't see it all in one trip, 2 trips, nor half a dozen. Lumpkin County feels proud of the great plant which is being put up by our northern friends who have confidence enough in our minds to come down here and spend their time and money on our mineral resources. For W.B. Townsend, that's almost over the top. That's pretty amazing to me. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, this is the scene in the back of the Consolidated gold mine. The chimney would be about here. An interesting thing, if you can see, there's a big barrel-shaped item there. That's one of the chlorination barrels that weighed 16 tons that they had to bring in 2 of them here and build a 4-story chlorination plant. The boat field house that's over there would be somewhere along this area. That's where the assay office would be located at one point. Now, the Consolidated company had lots of grand plans. I think it's important to take a look at President J.W. Adams. He was quite the philanthropist. He was an architect up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he was largely responsible for a lot of the redevelopment of Chattanooga after the Civil War. He built a lot of structures up there, and he even helped charter the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. He was one of the founders of that college. He contributed heavily to the Methodist Church up there, designed the steeple for the First Methodist in Chattanooga. He was quite an individual. But I think W.B. Adams, or J.W. Adams, excuse me, was really, he enjoyed being the sugar daddy for Dahlonega. I think he enjoyed walking through town, being the man with the money. And he really seemed to enjoy that to the max. And he had big plans for the town. He talked about electrification of the town. Now, remember, up to this point, everybody had kerosene lamps or candles. The street lights were kerosene. So for him to talk about electrifying the city of Dahlonega, that was big news. He also talked about building 200 cottages to house the workers. So if you think this was something like Chicopee Woods or one of the textile mill villages across the South, Dahlonega could very well look like that at some point after Mr. Adams got through with it. And he also was thinking about running a trolley line from Dahlonega down to the mine so that the workers could go back and forth on the trolley. You know, for those of you, if you've watched the TV show Gold Rush, Mr. Adams reminds me of Todd Hoffman. He sees the big picture. He has the grandiose idea and vision, but he really kind of gets lost a little bit on the details of how to make it happen. Well, with all this excitement, all this activity and money coming into the town, people began to think about how are we going to celebrate the opening of this business. Well, a group of citizens began to get together and they started working on plans to celebrate the grand opening. And our editor wrote in the Nugget, March 2nd. It is expected that everything will be ready in the near future for President McKinley to touch the button and start the machinery of this big plant moving, providing proper connections can be made. So imagine that. In Little Dahlonega, the President of the United States is going to come down here and push the button to start the machine. So they had some big plans and big ideas. The Jubilee planning really got going. I think these folks really got carried away when they got into the planning stage. The Jackson Economist in March of 1900 wrote, at a meeting held with the leading citizens, the movement assumed organized form with the appointment of a number of committees to take charge of and develop the affair on a scale keeping with the great industrial and commercial importance of the matter. This wasn't just a business opening in Dahlonega. It just wasn't something happening in Lumpkin County. This was something even greater than North Georgia. The committee was looking at this as something of national significance, this huge mill they were building, this gold mine we were going to open, and we're going to have the president come out and get it started. Well, they began working on these plans, and they decided finally on the schedule here on some events. On opening day to be held May 2nd, there were going to be meetings by all the local bigwigs, state senators, governors. I'm sure Mr. Adams would have a lengthy speech he was planning. And I think that's William Jennings Bryan there. I don't know if he would be invited or not, but they were going to have a lot of folks coming and speechifying to the crowd. The next day, Thursday, May the 3rd, will be the formal starting of the mill by the President of the United States pushing the button. And also, Governor Chandler and other state officials from the state of Georgia would be here. And the evening banquet would be held in a large tent, like a circus tent or a giant revival tent. So we were going to feed everybody that came down for this big event. Transportation was going to kind of be an issue. Because you got to remember, most of the directors and a lot of the investors in this company were coming from Toledo or Delaware, Ohio. They're going to have to ride a train to Chattanooga, take the train from Chattanooga to Atlanta, from Atlanta, change trains, drive to Gainesville. From Gainesville, Mr. D.E. Evans of Gainesville has the contract for hauling the crowd of capitalists to Dahlonega. And although the job is a big one, he says he'll get them there on time. All right, so you can imagine 500 people make a long train ride like that. Then they got to load them on carriages and bring them on the muddy dirt roads all the way to Dahlonega. Well, about this time, our faithful editor, Mr. Townsend, who I would describe mostly as kind of an assertive kind of guy, he called it like he saw it. He became the voice of reason. In the midst of all this euphoria about what was happening in this new company and all these activities, he woke everybody up. He sent a wake-up call in the March 16th edition of the Nugget where he said, much is being said about the Jubilee, which is proposed to be had in the early part of May by our citizens to show their appreciation for the large amount of money spent by the Consolidated Gold Mining Company, at which 500 or more persons are expected. We appreciate all the company has done as much as anybody. But our honest opinion is that this Jubilee had better be postponed until it seemed Dahlonega can care for this crowd. Pretty good thinking. First of all, where do we put them? Now, if you remember, I said that Dahlonega was a town of less than 900 people. And we had 600 workers. We already had people like Mr. Adams, the mill constructor, the foreman, a lot of big wheels and dignitaries associated with the mine already had all the hotel room filled. Everybody that had a boarding house had workers still in it. There were folks sleeping in the open fields around here until they got tents at the Consolidated Commissary and could put them in tents like an old-fashioned Civil War campground. But there was not any room at the end, so to speak. And Mr. Townsend wrote, here we are, with every house full from cellar to garret, 5 or 6 occupy the same building everywhere an opportunity is offered, and each hotel's full nearly all the time. How do we expect to take care of such a crowd? Some say we can put bunks in the courthouse, in churches and other places. But bunks cost $2 a piece. And who's going to pay for 500 bunks just to use for one night? Remember, today's money, convert that $30,000. Who's going to want to spend $30,000 to put 500 people up one night and have them sleep in the aisle of church in town? Got a pretty good point there. Then the hospitality after the long train ride. We've already talked about that long ride coming down on the train and all the transfers and getting in the carriage. Well, and then you got to sit there when they get to town, they're going to listen to all those speeches out in the hot sun. Well, he wrote, should it be done, what northern gentleman is going to come several hundred miles and sleep in a bunk at a crowded time when he can come when it's quiet, see everything that should be seen and not have to conserve his time listening to someone making a long-winded speech? No, let us not rank these gentlemen to come in such large numbers until we're able to care for them properly. Well, after that, the committee, I'm sure, kind of rocked back on the heels and said, what do we do now? You know, he had some valid points there. What are we going to do to accommodate all these folks? This has already been in newspapers across the state about this big grand opening. And finally, a week later, the Dahlonega Nugget, March 23rd, put out their cover story here. Quite likely the Jubilee, which was to have taken place on May 2nd and 3rd, will be postponed until some later date on account of so much rainy weather, which retarded mill hands work in this section. So we'll blame it on the weather. It's going to be too rainy for us to do this. We can't do it. That's the cover story. So the question is, what ended up happening? Well, interestingly enough, it's hard to say definitively for two reasons. First of all, the issue of the Dahlonega Nugget covering the weekend of the grand opening celebration is missing from the newspaper archives from the Georgia Historical Newspaper Collection. So it's hard to say definitively. And also, there's the second event that occurred at the Consolidated Gold Mines that trumped everything. You know, sensational stories sell newspapers. So what story did people choose to cover? Skull crushed with spade, Negro and white man engage in deadly combat underground. You know, that is the newspaper story that when you look, I think every newspaper in Georgia carried that story, where they were having a little combat underground after a disagreement. One had his skull fractured. They thought he was going to die, but eventually he recovered. The guy that hit him with a shovel was eventually captured by a posse over near Auraria and went to prison. So with all this, what can we say? What did they do? Well, I finally found in the morning news of Savannah, Georgia, May 4th, right after the grand opening was supposed to originally occur, the rain didn't stop things too much. They wrote, water has for the first time turned through the Consolidated Gold Mining Company's large milling plant at Dahlonega, and machinery is running smoothly with precision. Many people visited the plant to witness the trial. Many people visited the company. So that's about all we have to go on there. So we can say a lot different than what was originally proposed. So in conclusion, let me say, reading a little bit about J.W. Adams, it's inconceivable that they could have had any kind of opening without him making a speech. He probably had the board members there and influential citizens to speak about the grand opening and what a wonderful accomplishments they had made and what they were going to do for the town. Also, anecdotally, I have read that a lot of local citizens, soon after the mine began operation, they walked out, I assume, on the hill where the VFW is. There were not as many trees back then. They walked out there on a moonlit night and looked down in the valley below and watched the Consolidated mill in operation. Everything brightly lit by incandescent lights, and you're out there in the moonlight listening to it go clear clack and thundering, you know, crushing ore originally. So it's just an informal assembly where most of the town ended up on the hillside watching. But one thing we do know positively, and that's that President McKinley never pressed the button to start the business. With that, folks, I appreciate you having me and letting me talk. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
What did they use chlorine for in that? I mean, I'm familiar with using certain acids, sulfuric. and
You know,
mercury.
gold is a noble metal. Not many things react with it.
Right.
Cyanide reacts with it, and chlorine does. So when they dissolve that ore with chlorine gas, it removed the gold in the form of a salt, which they could precipitate. Then they could filter that out and get the gold out of the ore. When they couldn't catch it with mercury, which was the common way they used it previously. So that's why they did chlorination.
Now, was that chlorine recaptured and recycled? Or
No. And you can imagine, you know,
How long did they?
Osher would have a fit today, you know, over something like this,
Yeah.
but they had to haul wagon loads, demijohns, glass demijohns of sulfuric acid, which was one of the other important ingredients in this process.
Yeah.
Sulfuric acid, they generated the hydrogen gas in the chlorination barrels, but when they popped the top on that barrel, it's the chlorine dissipated. And some of it, you know, may have, I would have to look at the chemistry again, I don't recall right offhand, some of that was probably precipitate too. You know, it was flushed after the river.
Chlorine gas would have gone to above.
Most of it.
The
was-
salt, some of the salt would have been.
Some of the salts settled out, but most of it, I think, when they popped the top on those barrels, it volatilized. Anybody else got a question? Yes,
How long did it stay in operation?
until 1906. Went out of business in 1906.
Do you have any idea how much gold they got out of it?
No, most of those records are long gone. We can estimate they made quite a lot of gold in certain areas, but they kind of operated with very inefficient management to start with. For the end, they were operating efficiently, but they had spent all their operating capital up front, so they couldn't stay in business.
I've heard that, to this day, that they guesstimate that only about 10% of the gold has been taken out of the hill.
I heard that. I don't know how you come up with that number, and I've heard that kicked around a lot,
Too.
but there's definitely still gold here.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And the Consolidated company went out of business before they were able to really mine deeply. Now, the predominant theory in those days was the deeper you go, the richer it's going to get. Now, whether or not that's true, who knows? But I'm sure there's still a lot of gold in there. Yes. Who owns it now? Mr. Brian Whitfield, that's the Whitfield family owned.
How long did the hand ditch or the operate? And the trestle, when it kind of went across Wimpy Mill and all that?
Right. The hand ditch ran until, I think, the 1920s. Sometime around the 1920s, it was getting, they were still powering the city of Delaware with the generators down at the time. It wasn't being used for mining, it was just solely being used to run the generators. But finally, the tubes and things got in such bad repair, they finally scrapped it in about 1921, 1922, the Housers installed the big water wheel at Canyon Creek, and they started generating power for the city. Yes.
We just happen to have a hand ditch book, just a report, a hand ditch. Very interested in it.
I've got several copies.
She's got
Yeah,
a,
that's a fascinating book.
Somebody once said if you, if your first time becoming a member, you get one free. Or if you haven't gotten one yet, if you're a member, you get one free.
I got a question for you, and also kind of goes over to David.
Yeah.
Now, we know that they've been trying to get the water out of some of the tunnels that have been inaccessible to the mine tours there. What is the current progress that they've been able to find, or they're gonna open up more?
I defer to my chauffeur in the back on that.
We've made good progress, and then progress halted. And then we make bad progress, and then we recover and make good progress. So we are still expanding. The last layers of gravel will go in the tunnels the next coming weeks. The shaft that Greg was mentioning, it was hoping to go deeper to find richer gold. We've uncovered the shaft. It's open now. We let it refill with water because all the timber structure is still in place. We didn't want to dry out, so to speak, all the work. But we have been down 100 and, see, Jamie has dropped down 145 feet or 140 feet, somewhere in there. So we have lowered a person down. Look, it's been quite exciting. We've got a few artifacts along the way. So I hope the dream is by October of this year, it'll be open to the public. You'll be able to stand at the midsection of the shaft and look up, then look down and be able to see that. And that'll be our 30th anniversary of underground tour. It's a big, great way to celebrate tours by being able to open the shaft.
Is that gonna coincide with Gold Rush weekend?
I hope not. I'll be a busy weekend, but it very well could. But
Now, you mentioned artifacts. Have you found any like machinery that was still down there?
we've recovered one of the skip cars, one of the skips that hauled ore cars from the bottom up. This was got some original little rails on it, most of the canopy and stuff. It'll have to go under a pretty good bit of repair and stuff. Greg's gonna help with it. He's
Yes.
super excited.
Be glad to
Some
do.
hand tools, hand steels, wrenches, stuff like that. We found a shoe, a leather shoe. It was not as intact as I would like for it to be, but it's been underwater since 1906, 1907, somewhere in that
Something like
range.
that.
So it's been underwater a long time, but it's currently still in water to keep it drying out. It's kind of cool. And where we found it, it couldn't have gotten there any other way than somebody lived. At the bottom of the shaft is an additional tunnel, and we think we found that tunnel, but unfortunately, at the moment, there's a debris field that's keeping us from finding the actual tunnel opening and moving.
So are you pumping water out of it or is it draining out?
No, it has to be pumped. That'll be a different.
The question up here was, how deep is the mine? Basically, the tunnel that we get tours in is 200 feet below Walmart, consider that the 200-foot level. And the next one down is about 160 feet or so. You know, typically mines in those days, about every 100 feet was another level, and then they'd stope up or sink down one or the other.
So how far is it to go to get to wherever the heck the bottom is?
Well, we don't know for sure, maybe 20 feet. you
Oh, so
think?
you're close.
Yeah, it's close.
Oh, yeah, I would think that where the debris field starts, we can't get past this moment. Constraints of our equipment is no more than about 20 feet.
And why was there so much water in the mine? What,
Just below the water that.
so
Natural groundwater.
you're taking the water out and it's coming back in
Yes, actively, continuously.
continuously. You have to continuously pump
You
it.
can stand in the shaft and look up and there's spring and drip.
Hmm.
But we can, luckily.
You keep pumped out fast enough.
And so you got to remember, when you get to the bottom, you're not just draining the shaft, you're draining the lower level too.
Right.
So that's a lot.
It's a lot of water.
A lot of water that has to come out.
So you had a nice little project with a third party who brought in the robots and stuff. Can you talk about that? That's just so fascinating.
Well, that was me. Dee may want to talk about that, but the folks that brought in the robots and the GPS units, and they went through the mine on the level that we toured now, and they did plots with GPS and everything. So they basically constructed a wireframe. You know, you've seen those on the computer, a whole 3D kind of arrangement where you can see. They also, on one of our winds that goes down to a lower level, it's flooded, they had a submersible that they set down in there, and they shot video of that. So we've got drone footage, underwater drone footage, and just mapping the whole area, because it's pretty fascinating. There's a lot of area that we don't go through on tours. Some of it's too unstable, unsafe to go in. But this is going to allow the mine to make a 3D model of the mine probably at some point.
Oh, you don't have it
Also
yet.
lets us know what some of these areas are, how far they go, that sort of thing. You know, on that lower level, we're trying to reach with the sinking shaft, clearing that out. You know, you always hope there's a train of ore cars down there, or a bunch of artifacts left, you know.
Yeah.
Because that was mentioned in the negatives being a particularly rich part of the mine, so who knows, there might be some really cool stuff. Yes,
Well, I have heard stories that Consolidated had shafts under the line, under the town.
I've heard that story too. But
Tunnels,
I think
not
we
shafts.
should discount
Yeah.
that. However, when they were blasting in the Consolidated mine, it did rattle the windows on the public square. Yeah. But as far as there being tunnels under there.
No.
Yes,
Did they not, back then, they didn't map out these maps and diagrams of where the tunnels were?
there's some. I found there's an obscure department of the government under that actually maintains maps of old mines. And I was able to contact them, and I have a map. It was made in the 1930s when Dr. Arnold owned the property, and he was thinking about selling. So we have a geologic map of that level. It was made then. But the other levels aren't included in that map. So there's still parts that are, people have been in, but they're unmapped to my knowledge. Unless Brian's got something in the file cabinet, I don't know. Yes?
When they were doing all this new explorations, y'all find any more gold?
They ain't telling.
There's some veins in there that I've seen that I would love to do an assay on. Because you gotta remember, when the mine was in operation, back in the good old days, gold was $20 an ounce. Now it's almost $2,000 an ounce, so something that wouldn't pay back then would today. So, who knows?
That's opening can of worms.
But there could be some rich ore down there, there sure could be.
In particular, there was a beautiful thing of quartz found near the shaft before we had never seen due to just the walls being muddy and dirty and no lights, kind of going here looking to try to figure out weird stuff. But now that you can walk it without the fear of stepping on something, falling in a hole, and you look and we pressure wash the walls with a huge vein of quartz. Absolutely beautiful. And then I had a chance, we pulled some pieces of, and we had a chance to find some of the sulfide ore from the pyrites right out of the wall. With just a little chunk, really pretty.
Yeah, but pretty is one thing, but having force doesn't necessarily make it so, right?
That's right.
No, but a lot of times when it's stained
Yeah.
certain ways,
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
yeah.
Just.
No X-ray diffraction done on that quartz.
Yes,
Did you say they closed in 1906?
yes.
Well, if they were doing so well, why did they close?
They weren't.
Because when they first started, the management had champagne taste. They built a huge plant with 120 stamps. They probably should have built one before it.
Yeah.
You know, they spent a lot of other money, and they ran out of money out of that $5 million they spent it all. They had to get a loan for, what was it, $175,000, I think? And when that note came due, they couldn't pay. They'd spent all their money on extravagant things. They actually brought in a lot of miners from out west, thinking that local miners, hillbillies don't know anything. So the miners that they brought in from out west knew about western mining, but they didn't know local geology. And in some cases, they sunk shafts that were further away from the vein as they went deeper instead of closer to it, which is just opposite what you're supposed to be doing. So due to things like that, they spent a lot of work capital, and they were just not being able to meet their obligations. Yes.
Another humorous story, the Walmart gold rush.
Right? When they built Walmart and they were excavating for the foundation, they hit a vein up there.
Oh.
Heavy in pyrites. And I understand everybody stopped their equipment, started backing their trucks up. And most of it, I think, was pyrite. But gold is found with pyrite sometimes.
Yeah, what I heard was the next morning there wasn't a piece of quartz to be seen.
Yeah. I think they cleared that area out pretty well. Pretty efficient.
There are a lot of stamp mills. I've seen the remnants of the one at Finley. And then a second question, when the Consolidated was running, say, 120 stamps, how loud was that?
Loud.
It would have been loud. Now, the full 120 stamps will run for a relatively short period of time. And then they cut down to 40, at times they were running 15, that kind of thing. But the full 120 stamps were mainly run just in the beginning when they were running stockpile ore right after they built the building. And they found out that a lot of these veins were not that wide. They'd run a little distance and pinch out. And then you'd hit another vein over here. It was rich for a little bit, then pinch out. So it was on again, off again kind of situation. It wasn't a steady supply of 22-foot wide gold vein. So
So there were stamp mills.
there were stamp mills all over. People say you could hear them all over town. I've heard old timers that we used to know that say, oh, of a night you could hear all the stamp mills running back when the Calhoun and others were in business. And I'm sure it was pretty loud.
Mhm. Well, if that stamp mill that's over there at the park, I mean, if you've ever heard that running, and it's just one, it's pretty darn loud.
If you've heard one running, they're pretty loud.
Right.
And
It's not even-
surprisingly, a lot of times, the ones I've heard running, unless you have a lot of ore under them, you hear a clackety clack. People talk about it thundering, but what I hear is just a super loud clackety clack as they run. So I'm sure it got on everybody's nerves after a while. Yeah, a lot of stamps. All right, I don't want to drag this out, but does anybody else got a question? We got a Zoom with them?
No.
All right, folks, thank you very much.